Today I will be discussing the topic known as the narcissistic eye, which is the stance or way of gazing that which you can identify a narcissist through. Which, when you identify a narcissist, you are now, as we know, an empath. But in the empath is the opposite known as the narcissist, where you see the prey and predator stance that which we as humans approach life in. But what causes these two different perspectives or ways of taking a stance which lead to what is known as suffering? In the understanding that a narcissist causes suffering to an empath, we have to understand what causes an individual to become a narcissist. If an empath can recognize pain within an individual, which they can sense as an empathetic self, they can say that a narcissist actively generates pain upon the empaths. But what causes a narcissist? A narcissist is an individual who themselves has suffered pain, but in the idea of controlling, they are individuals actively controlling the factors that lead to their own pain. They're controlling every single factor in order to prevent themselves from once again experiencing pain, which the empath does not recognize. The empath only sees a narcissist as a person that is a predator. And in this notion, here's the idea. If a narcissist is a predator or an individual who controls others, why is it that a narcissist might control others? Well, let's see it from this perspective of the victim empath or the narcissist, the hero, which now you take on the prey and predator stance, which you can identify a narcissist through their eyes. In the particular notion that an empath, if I may take my glasses off for a second, when an empath looks at the world, they look at it wide-eyed because they're, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Whereas if you were a narcissist, you would see the eyes are more focused. They have an active frown, which I myself will identify myself as a narcissist for the sake of the argument, because I know very well any known psychologist or person trained in psychology has to take on this particular stance, which is the stance of the narcissist. Because unless if an individual hones in on their eyeballs, which creates a state of focused staring, which any trained person that has undergone or is learning to identify factors which lead and cause pain, and in the controlling of these factors to identify each factor and controlling each of these factors in order to prevent once again the individual from suffering pain. If I was to pull back on a bow or shoot a gun, you do not do it wide-eyed. And why is that? Because in order to gain a better state of focus, you need to somehow focus your eyes. You cannot look through a scope wide-eyed, because the moment you open your eyes, you're seeing the world as a victim. Whereas if you seek to be actively engaging your life through a state of focused scope, you need to essentially squint your eyes a little bit, which is the narcissistic gaze. And I'm not speaking about gaze as in gaze in lesbians, I'm speaking about eyesight here, known as a gaze. Which, if an individual that has a narcissistic gaze, they see the eyes through a focused lens. So they may identify the controlling factors which they can actively engage in controlling in order to prevent themselves from experiencing pain. What differentiates an empath and a narcissist, a prey and a predator, a victim and a hero, is the idea or the notion that one has not experienced enough life and the other has experienced too much of life. Which the moment you see the perspective change, you now begin to see that an empath is an individual that seeks to remain a victim. They feel empowered in their victimhood, where they're actively choosing to say, I don't want to look at the world through a focused lens. And when you see the difference of the approach, now you can understand why narcissists prey on empaths. Because a narcissist, being an individual that seeks to actively control, a narcissist seeks an empath as a partner because the empath is more easily controlled. They have not experienced life enough. They see it through a wider stance, a wider scope of using their eyes. Which, if you were to identify looking at different individuals now, which in order to specifically be in the world, you can't have your eyes looking down whenever you walk. That is an act of submission, and that is the act of an empath, because you're afraid to make eye contact. You're submissive, the victim. The empath is a victim self that does not idealize the idea of making eye contact unless if it is meant to say, I'm sorry that happened to you. And in this notion, the empath is a person that doesn't have a vice that which causes them to take on their heightened state of focused glare, their heightened state of the narcissistic gaze. In order to identify this, now when you see a narcissist, you will individualize them and specifically be able to point them out, because narcissists are individuals that are continuously scanning the environment. They are a predator. They're continuously looking throughout their environment to seek and be able to basically scan the environment for other narcissists, other predators. Which, if you learn the idea of the prey and the hunter, the hunted and the hunter, you now see the idea that an individual that is of a narcissistic tendency has a greater perspective into the world because they have experienced more. They've experienced more pain, which in result has caused their eyes to take a stance of focus. The narcissistic gaze. This allows for the narcissist, which predominantly, as we know the story of Narcissus, which is the man that fell in love with his own reflection. But what is the idea of falling in love with your reflection? Knowing your reflection is imperfect, do you choose to actively engage in saying you're continuously perfect and you can do no wrong? That is one type of narcissist, which once again is a lower state of narcissist. Where now, as if you look at a heightened state of narcissist, the individual knows themselves as a sinner, which they recognize they have caused pain. They recognize they have sinned. And in order to prevent this from continuing to happen, they take on, once again, a heightened level of narcissist, which the higher you climb, eventually you end up at a psychopathic narcissist, which is so controlling you are actively ready to take other people's lives in order to prevent your own from being taken. And these individuals, the further up into their gazing of the world lens, through the iris of their eyes, the more an individual climbs this lattice, for lack of a better word, of the mental realm, the more an individual climbs this psychopathic lattice, you now see that there's once again a state of consciousness that which we climb through, not in just the physical matter, but as well as in the mental realm, which is as a result specifically correlated to the amount of pain that the individual has suffered in their life. If you have not suffered anything, you see yourself as a victim to everything, because you're actively trying to basically say, this causes me suffering, this causes me suffering, this causes me suffering, and I don't know what to do. Whereas a narcissist knows, this has caused me suffering, this has caused me suffering, and this has caused me suffering, but through my gaze, I have learned to identify the factor that which causes these effects to take part in my life. And unless if the individual now sees the narcissist as the hero, which has risen above their suffering, whereas the empath is the individual that has chosen to stay in their suffering, the two mentalities, the two types of people in their life, which if you are an empath, you are a prey, because you're actively choosing to stay in the prey state. Now that I've identified this going forward, because if you can no longer choose to say, I need to be able to identify my factors in order to take a greater scope at the approach, the moment you take on a focused scope of your eyesight, where you are now actively scanning the environment, and you now see the empaths walking with their heads down, or the narcissist that is continuously scanning their environment, the prey and predator stance. Women typically, from a young age, take on a more empathetic state, which if you remain as an empath your whole life, I would argue you have not suffered enough, because you never learned to identify the factors that which cause your suffering. And if it's the narcissist that's causing your suffering, how do you combat a narcissist? By becoming a narcissist. Because if you're unable to specifically identify the factors in order to point out that is a narcissist, then you remain as an empathetic self, as a person that actively seeks to choose and stay within the victim state of life. Where now a woman might see a narcissist as an individual with a drive, an individual with motivation that is precise in their actions, because unless if they remain precise in their control, they themselves experience pain. What would you choose from this point forward? Would you choose to say, I suffer, but I'd like to stay a victim and remain in my own suffering? Or would you actively choose to say, I've suffered, but now I choose to control the factors to prevent myself from experiencing pain? The two different states result in the two different personalities, that which all personalities rippled from. And there are different states of each of these personalities. or specifically 7 different points of consciousness taking form in these states. An individual that predominantly lives only in the notion of understanding the physical world is an empath. They only recognize the physical self. They are wide-eyed because they can only see and basically understand your suffering to a perspective, but they cannot offer advice. Where now, as we look at individuals that have been trained in psychology or combat or anything that requires a survival mode to be engaged in order to identify factors that could lead to your own pain. And if you cannot identify the pain you suffer, then how can you give advice? Your advice is now worthless because you're actively telling that person it's okay to be a victim. Do you really choose to stay a victim? Or would you choose to grow beyond that, to mature, to become from prey to predator? That is the ultimate question. Because if you're now actively saying, I would like to remain a prey, so be it. But do not see narcissists as entirely evil. Because a narcissist is what allows the empath to essentially identify their own problems. Which, if an empath is a person that is wide-eyed, you are like the Eye of Sauron, actively looking at everything, but the moment the eye focuses, it finds Frodo, the victim. And in the idea of finding the victim, you're actively seeking and destroying that which is the victim. Do you now see that if I open my eyes wide, it essentially causes me to look at the world through a submissive state? You're backing up your head in order to look at the world through a wider scope. Where now, as an individual that has a narcissistic gaze, a glare through their eyes, they now see their gaze focused. And the more focused the gaze is, the more the individual has the ability to identify the problems. Which, in identifying the problems, you give greater advice. Because you can actively say, this is what's causing your suffering. From this point on, it is up to you whether you choose to say, I choose to remain in that suffering, or do I choose to grow and mature? A empath is in essence a child, which we still see childlike individuals in their adulthood and even sometimes in their old age, because they never matured. Where now we see the narcissist, an individual that has grown, that has learned to focus their iris in their eyes, resulting in them being able to identify and control the factors that lead to their pain, and they're actively choosing to say, I've identified these factors, and I am choosing not to engage in factors that cause me pain. That is the predominant state between an empath and a narcissist. And now, why is it that an empath and a narcissist oftentimes come together in relationships? I wouldn't necessarily argue that, yes, to a certain degree, a narcissist preys upon the prey itself. The predator takes on a prey to remain as a companion. Why? Because in a relationship, If an individual is a prey or an empath, they are easily controlled because the narcissist has been hurt in previous relationships to the point they have chosen to say, I don't want a person that is also a predator. I want somebody that's going to love me like a dog, you could say, like a child. That no matter what you do to that individual in your controlling state, they return to you in a loving manner because that's all they know. They are at a childlike resonance where now we see the narcissist, the decisions I've just explained. Why is it that a narcissist chooses an empath? And why would an empath choose a narcissist as their partner unless if they are actively seeking to grow and mature in their own mind in order to focus their iris? Which the moment you focus your iris, you are now a narcissist. You are now an individual that can identify factors in your life which cause you pain. You've taken on a perspective. You've taken on a scope. Which a scope is in essence a precise prey or predator stance. Which the more we come to understand this, now you begin to see that yes, there are empaths and there are narcissists in the world. What you choose to be is entirely up to you. A victim will always seek to say they are a victim, whereas a hero will always seek to say they are a hero. But you cannot be a hero in being a victim, just as you cannot be a victim as in being a hero. You have a decision to make. Do you choose to stay as a child in your life, or do you choose to grow and mature into your adulthood, taking on a greater focus in your iris? The moment an individual squints their eyes and sees the world in a state of focus, which in order to squint your eyes, you have to frown your brow a little bit. It is a more aggressive gaze, which guess what? Most women find this attractive, but then find themselves victimized in the notion that they chose a narcissist for his appearance physically, but choose to victimize themselves over the mind approach, which if you wish to understand matter or physics or metaphysics, quantum physics, psychology, you need to understand this particular principle. Matter is a low state resonance of energy which allows it to take form. And the moment you engage in a higher state of consciousness, you now enter a mental state, your internal self. And from the internal self, you then enter the spiritual. But in order to do so, you need a way of focusing the bridge. Because unless if you can actively create the connecting path, you remain a victim, you remain an empath, you remain a childlike person, which sees the world wide-eyed. The moment an individual learns the difference between an empathetic gaze and a narcissist gaze, you now see what causes the world to move and what causes the world to stay stagnant, which is what differentiates a hero and a victim. A victim chooses in the end their own victimhood, unless if they grow beyond it. You remain stagnant unless if you learn to grow beyond the victim or empathetic self. And in order to be a hero, you understand your suffering, which is why a trained professional in psychology or any individual trained in psychology, when listening to you, they don't look at you wide-eyed. A trained professional or a narcissist, when they listen to you, they're actively looking at your problems, scoping your sentences, identifying where the factors are that lead to your pain. And unless if an individual takes on this scope, they're an empath and they don't give good advice. And for individuals to be empaths now, saying this is how the world should be, you haven't gained enough experience. You haven't suffered enough. You remain suffering in your victimhood because you're not choosing to take on a focus, a disciplined mind, which results in a body first being disciplined through suffering. In discipline, you hone your skills that cause you to have a greater control over factors that cause you suffering. The predator stance. And in order to say as an empath that the world should only be ran by empaths and that narcissists are a danger, yes and no. It is all about the approach and understanding of identifying factors that a narcissist has, which is not driven specifically in the definition of the narcissist, but is driven specifically in the personality of the individual, their own individual self. The less reflective an individual, the more negative of a narcissist they are. The less good of a person they are. Where now you see the rise of good narcissists, which are once again the battle between good and evil, which you as a child, you do not face war. You do not get drafted into war as a childlike being. And unless if you take on a predator stance, the good can identify the bad, just as the bad can identify the good. The difference is the approach that which you can identify the factors that cause these things. Thank you.